Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this talk as part of the National Grazing Lands meetings this year. My name is Dr. Eric Billman, and I am a research agronomist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service, located just a little ways west of you over in Florence, South Carolina. I apologize that I'm not able to be there with you in person this year, but hopefully this presentation will be almost as good as if I was giving it there in person myself. So with that, I'd like to share with you some of my ongoing research into how we are working to integrate perennial forages into our southeastern row cropping systems and some of the unique benefits that can offer us here in the Southeast. I'd like you to imagine for a moment the concept of planting your initial field of forages in the fall, say October-ish time, and allowing those plants to persist through the winter and into the spring, grazing them or harvesting them as necessary. And then come the end of the spring in May or April, you're able to no-till or strip-till row crops into it. And then we can focus on our row cropping needs for the summer months. And then as soon as those row crops are harvested in the fall, we're able to go right back in and have perennial forages already established. And that's the kind of system in which I envision for this work. So with that, I will go ahead and get into things. So in conceptualizing this work, I first was trying to consider the needs of our forages versus traditional row cropping system and trying to figure out where those systems can interplay with each other. So with forages, we traditionally are looking at having forage availability year-round, and that usually necessitates a blending of cool and warm season species together. So we have availability at all times of the year. It also means we want to have high forage biomass and pretty moderate to high crude protein concentrations and relatively low fiber concentrations so that digestibility and animal intake are not negatively affected. Now, on the row cropping side of things, we're looking at having timely planting and harvest of those crops, which can sometimes get in the way of our forage needs traditionally, as well as having pretty high soil fertility, which forages generally require as well. But the difference is that those row crops deplete that soil much more rapidly than the forage systems do. And finally, having relatively low weed pressure. And in order to do that, most row cropping systems have adopted a very high rate of pesticide usage. And that often is not compatible with forage crops. Things like glyphosate or glufosinate and Roundup and Liberty or 2,4-D are not compatible with forage systems because we don't have the GM technology that our row cropping counterparts have already developed. So in terms of where these systems overlap, I see it in a couple of ways. In the forage side of things, we're looking at trying to have forages that have reduced summer growth and identifying them. And that also means that we want plants that have a low canopy height so that they're not out competing or really fighting too much for light with our establishing row crops. And we also want to have a persistence in those forages under heat and drought stress conditions because they're going to be surviving in the summer months when down here in the Southeast, we have extremely hot weather and potentially dry weather, especially over here on the coastal plain where you're at right now over in Myrtle Beach. Now, when we look at the row cropping side of how to overlap these, we need row crops that can handle being planted a little later in the spring so that we can most maximize our forage production into the peak of springtime in April and early May. We also need systems that are adapted to, or crops that are adapted to no-till or strip tillage. And then we also need to be thinking about what kind of row crops can provide substantial canopy cover to insulate those forages in the inner row spaces so that they persist and aren't detrimentally harmed by intense heat and drought stress. Now, there was some work conducted by Dr. Ken Moore of Iowa State a number of years ago that was looking at using perennial, what he dubbed perennial ground cover in between the rows of corn in the Midwest. And he found some decent success doing that work, but I don't believe it was evaluated heavily for forage use, more as an alternative weed control method. And as far as I recall, was only looking at Kentucky bluegrass in that system. So that work was kind of the impetus for what we're doing here. So I think the answer to how to interlock these systems revolves around having the use of perennial cool season forage species, which are admittedly a little atypical for the Southeast, but I think under this system where they're a little more protected, they can be very productive and meet most of the criteria that I mentioned in terms of availability when we need it around the row crops needs. And on the row cropping side, I think an interesting and unique twist for us is that in the Southeast, we have a crop not widely cultivated elsewhere in the US, which is cotton. And that species is that crop is widely cultivated throughout our region and in the South in general, and has very strong, importantly, very strong canopy closure capabilities in the peak of its life cycle in July, August, and September, when temperatures are traditionally at their highest here. And that can provide that insulation from solar radiation that I mentioned. So some potential benefits of combining these species together is that those forages are available immediately up to planting, almost just a couple of days before, whatever time necessary to prep the field for the row crop. And then pretty much as soon as that row crop comes off, you're able to send livestock back in or get back in there with hay harvesting equipment and take that material that's been growing in the canopy all year round off. There's also a minimization of cost where you're planting the first year, not having any annual sowing taking place. And that also allows for the optional overseeding of annuals like annual ryegrass, for instance, that allow us to have a more fleshed out forage system if our perennials aren't doing or aren't producing enough biomass for us. And finally, that reduction in weed pressure, I think, is a major benefit to this system. This is a picture taken from my study just prior to cotton defoliation this fall, and you can see how well it's doing at choking out any other weed competition in that interrow space. And that also allows us to reduce our pesticide application and have more sustainable cropping systems. So the objective of this project was to compare our forage production, weed suppression, and persistence of our perennial species that we have in our treatments as compared to systems where we had a traditional annual and a weedy fallow grown in tandem with cotton production. And we hypothesized that our perennial forage treatments would persist in the lower canopy of cotton throughout the year and have greater weed suppression than the annual fallow plots that were terminated prior to cotton production, which are more indicative of regular or more representative of regular cotton production. And that there'd be no negative drawbacks on our cotton production by having those perennial forages. Now, when we established this study, we did so at Clemson University's PD Research and Education Center near our location just outside of Florence. And we planted it with a brilliant broadcast seeder in the fall of 2020 last year into a prepared seedbed to give these clovers and grasses the best chance to establish themselves. And that was following a corn crop just because of how early we needed to get it in. And so for this work, we had a 4 treatment scheme in a Latin square design where we had a fallow unplanted weedy control, so nothing planted in there, no herbicides applied to it. We also had annual ryegrass using a blended or a blend known as DH3 sold by Southern States that is a diploid blend, and then a 50-50 mix of red and white clover using a Southern Belle for the red clover and Will Ladino as the varieties for the white clover. And those were developed at both Florida and NC State respectively, and are pretty well adapted to our temperature extremes that we experience here in the Southeast. And finally, we had an even 3-way mix of annual ryegrass, red clover, and white clover. And this is a picture of one of the plots seen in the late winter around February of this past year. And we fertilized those at about 30 pounds of N per acre 6 weeks post germination, and then another 60 in February of this past winter. So as we then shift to cotton, our system required us to mow the biomass in those plots down in late April once we were done collecting any forage data off of them, and then strip till those plots with a deep strip tillage implement that goes down about 3.5 feet into the ground, because we have a lot of hard pan issues in our area. And then we had cotton planted with a precision planter on 38-inch centers in mid-May. And the only pesticide we used in this entire work, aside from cotton defoliating herbicides, was glyphosate 6 weeks post-cotton germination, because we were experiencing some issues with the clovers actually were so aggressively growing at that time that they were out-competing the cotton. So we had to do that to get the cotton up above everything. So as far as parameters that we assessed for our forage component of this, we looked at stand counts using a quadrat that had 6-inch square grids on it. So I would go out and count the number of plants within each of those grids several times and get an average of the number of plants per square foot. We also collected forage mass samples sequentially, so using repeated measures techniques to sample forage mass in March and April, as well as conducting weed pressure assessments at the same time we were doing the stand counts. During the cotton season from May to October, we had monthly biomass and stand counts being taken, as well as the end of season cotton yields. And then once the cotton was off, I took some final stand persistence ratings of our clovers to get a full annual assessment of how many clovers we had lost. So as we move into the results now, you'll note that we're starting with our spring forage mass data. We had a significant effect of both timing of those samplings as well as our treatments. And you'll note for these results that annual ryegrass and plots that or treatments that contained annual ryegrass really seem to provide a substantial boost to forage mass. Not surprising, if anyone's worked with ryegrass before, you know it's a prolific producer of forage mass in the springtime. A red clover plot and white clover plots did okay, but not any better than a weedy fallow, although that I'm sure the nutritional value is much higher. Now, in terms of our stand and persistence, for white clover, we didn't see any effect of treatment, but over time we saw a decline in white clover very rapidly from winter into the spring. And that's just like we lost some little seedlings that had germinated. But that population held pretty steady through the rest of the year, which is very promising to us at about 10 plants per square foot. Red clover, on the other hand, was affected both by our treatments and our harvest timing or sample timing, and declined similarly very quickly going into the spring. But we also saw that the three-way mix had fewer red clovers than our binary mixture. And by the summer, however, they kind of evened out and remain that way, but the overall population of red clover was very low compared to the white clover at less than 5 plants per square foot. With our ryegrass stand counts in the spring, we terminated that ryegrass prior to cotton planting, so we only have a couple of readings on this, but ryegrass obviously in the monoculture was more prevalent than in the mixture, not surprising, which can account for some of the results we saw on the forage mass side. Now, I think some of the most striking visual aids I have for you here are some of the pictures that I took of our summer weed suppression. And these pictures that I'm about to show you were taken in mid-August. So we had clover plots here. This is one of the 50-50 mixes of clover showing their weed suppression. If you can make out in the inner row spaces there, how much clover there is down in the lower canopy, choking out weeds. There are a couple of places where some goosegrass or crabgrass has come up through, but most of it's pretty well contained. Now, looking at a fallow plot where we had no ground cover planted at all, this is a mess of grass species up in those inner row spaces competing for nutrients and energy at the same time as those cotton plants are trying to grow. So quite striking. And as we move to our actual hard data on the stand counts of weeds per square foot, you'll note that in the spring, obviously our fallow plots had the most weed pressure, but both our ryegrass and our red and white clover mixtures were pretty weedy as well. Only the three-way mix was successful at choking out weeds with fewer than 10 per square foot. In the rest of the spring, the ryegrass monoculture caught up to the three-way mix, and in general, ryegrass seemed to be very effective at suppressing weeds in the spring. But once we get into the summer, the amount of weed pressure really was controlled by the presence of those annual clovers in the binary mixture and those that remained in the three-way mix. So it was all in all very effective compared to the fallow and plots that used to have ryegrass in them. And then that's confirmed by looking at our summer biomass, which is sort of another assessment of weed competition, where our red clover plots had and white clover plots had the fewest or had the least biomass compared to the other treatments in their inter-row spaces. And then finally, looking at our cotton yields, which I know we're all forage people here, but if we wanted to see any drawbacks to cotton production, numerically there are some differences here, but statistically we aren't seeing any significant difference in our cotton productivity between our treatments, which is a very promising sign. So again, when we're looking at all this data, our annual ryegrass growth in the spring as far as forage production is really unparalleled. It's very productive during that time of the year and indicates that we should probably look at adding a perennial grass into our treatment schemes to see how that compares to an annual. And our pure clover stands were produced similarly low biomass to the unplanted fallow, but that material was probably much higher in nutritive value than our weedy fallow would be. And during the summer, when our plots wouldn't be grazable, the biomass in those inter-row spaces again was much lower in the clover plots, which indicates reduced weed competition. Now, in terms of persistence, our white clover stands were not affected by the mixing of annual ryegrass with white clover, which tells us that white clover and ryegrass are good to pair together. But our white clover did decline over time, not surprising, but most of that happened in that initial winter to spring transition. So it can maintain itself through the rest of the year. However, our red clover stands did decline rapidly from winter into summer, being largely outcompeted by ryegrass, so maybe don't mix those together. But both held pretty steady through the summer, but red clover is generally not as vigorous and persistent as our white clover seem to be. Both species also appear to be relatively unaffected by our cotton defoliation pests or herbicides sprayed in the late fall or late summer, which is very promising to us because that was something I was very concerned about throughout this work. And our weed suppression was significantly better when our perennial clovers were present than when they weren't in the inter-row spaces of those cotton plants. And then finally, in looking at how our cotton production was affected, our seed and lint yields did not differ from each other, but there was a large variation between the plots within the same treatment, so that may have caused some of the numerical differences we were seeing. And that was related to some issues in cotton establishment in those perennials. I mentioned we had to spray glyphosate on them in order to knock back some of the clover at one time post-germination of cotton. So we're trying to figure out a way to better get that system working this coming year. But I think there's a lot of promise there. So in conclusion, our perennial clover forages can persist moderately well in our southeastern system, provided that they are regionally adapted varieties, of course. And I think this leaves room for further improvement of other forage species of any classification for this kind of system. And weed suppression potential during the summer is very good and dare I say even excellent. However, there are some kinks again to work out in how to establish cotton and keep our plant populations high. And our preliminary soil data that I didn't get a chance to mention as of yet, but we had moisture probes in those plots at the same time. And we have some preliminary data indicating that the upper 6 inches of soil remains wetter, longer compared to those that didn't have clover, likely due to just stopping solar radiation from getting down into that soil and drying it out faster. So we also had nutritive value samples taken, but I haven't had a chance to get those analyzed yet. But that should be done before the end of the calendar year. At this time, I'd like to thank the South Carolina Cotton Board and Cotton Incorporated for funding this project. They've been a lot of help to us, as well as my research technician, Mr. Daniel Holliday, and student workers, Donovan and Tyler, for their invaluable technical assistance, both in the field and the lab, and helping to carry this project out. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via my email here. eric.billman@usda.gov, and I'll be happy to field any questions that might come my way. Thank you again for your time, and have a good rest of the meeting.